So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own personal journey and why I am the way I am politically, and why I ended up really leaving and no longer identifying with the skeptic community, despite the fact that I still view myself as a skeptical person. So I'm going to try to break this down first by telling you a bit about my first exposure to YouTube and the internet in general, and then kind of how I got to the conclusions that I've personally drawn for myself. So I obviously was one of the generations that grew up with the internet already in existence. So I think my I guess political awakening really probably started in middle school when I started watching a lot of political commentary on YouTube. Some of it was pretty low level. Some of it was a little higher level, but not really. I watched a lot of users like The Amazing Atheist, Sargon of Akkad, Thunderfoot, Dark Matter 2525, lots and lots of users in those veins. And I spent a lot of time on forums, and in cults on vampirefreaks.com because I was an emo kid, non-conforming as could be. And so I definitely had a lot of involvement and a lot of discourse around, ideas of skepticism, around, theology and atheism, and of course why atheists are so much smarter and so much better than those dumb religious sheep people. Wake up, sheeple. A lot of really other shitty, toxic behaviors, to be completely honest. That I had myself, that I still unfortunately see within the community. It really hasn't changed much, and I think that's why I left. Because while the skeptic community really hasn't changed in the last decade or so, I have. I've changed a lot. And when I first, started in college after I finished running start, after finished high school, I started at university, and I would say at the beginning of my experience moving to Seattle, I would have probably fallen into a lot of anti-feminist camps. To an extent, I identified as a libertarian. I still would have said more Democrat, but I definitely didn't have the issues with libertarianism that I have now. I had a lot of racist views where I, just was not willing to have a productive conversation about race. I basically was of the opinion that racism is over and people need to stop whining about it, which is what a lot of people within the skeptic community seem to believe. They seem to think the only racism that remains is a few vestiges of the KKK and nothing else, and that black people need to stop whining. That is the gist of the argument I keep seeing from them. And I think my big problem with that is that lack of personal growth and that lack of growth as a community. I think part of where it comes from is the fact that the skeptic community erroneously views itself as objective. And this is because it's so tied in with atheism, it's so tied in with reason, it's so tied in with science, and it has a lot of prominent thinkers like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, and multiple others who are often problematic in their own ways, that kind of continue to feed into this idea that we're the only ones who are objective. We're the only ones who are really smart. Anyone who believes in Sky Daddy is dumb. That whole kind of way of making sort of an us versus them, where if you're not a skeptical atheist, then you're a fucking idiot. And I think that was an incredibly reductionist view to have of the world, and I think even if you don't believe it to that extent, I do think that is the tone that the community projects to itself and to others. And I think that's a big part of why the skeptic community is, to be completely honest, lacking in a lot of diversity. And while you will find the occasional person of color or woman in the skeptic community who's prominent, like Jacqueline Glenn or some black guy, that is a YouTube user. I'm not just being weird, I promise. It's still mostly cis white men, and you can tell because they make a lot of videos about how they are cis white men being so viciously maligned by feminism. And, I just have a couple of criticisms to that, because I think a lot of the thing is they tend to have this idea where they're going to criticize the victim complex of others while perpetuating their own victim complex about men. because they don't actually have a problem with victim complexes. No, they have a real problem with the fact that they feel that those complexes exclude them and don't benefit them. And I don't really even realistically think most feminists have a victim complex. I think acknowledging where victimization happens is a part that is necessary to solving the problem, but it's not like we all just sit on our hands and cry all day. We're living our lives, we're doing things, we're fine. Where should I start? Oh my god, this video is gonna be a bit of a mess. I know that already. So, you know, when I first moved to Seattle, most of the exposure I got to people that were not conservative Christians was on the internet because of where I grew up. So moving to Seattle was a huge culture shock for me in that there was just this vast diversity of political thought and all of these people with different perspectives and different ideas that I suddenly was thrown into the mix with and forced to interact with. I think moving to Seattle itself actually had a bigger impact on me than going to university. I think if I had gone to university in an eastern part of the state, I might still have a very different perspective from the one I have now. But I moved to Seattle, and I went to Seattle University, and the experience I had did force me to do a lot of really uncomfortable introspection. I had backlash moments where I just didn't want to believe it, and I dug in my heels and said, no, 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 no. You know, I had a lot of trouble with the concept that gender is a social construct, actually. Like, I was really upset about that for a few days, and I don't even know why. But it bothered me. It did. I found it upsetting. And then, as I thought about the idea more, as I gave myself time to interact with it, and as I, you know, did more of the readings suggested by my professors, and as I thought more critically about things that I had taken for granted, like the idea that there are only two genders, I started to break down those assumptions, and I think I became a more productive person in the way that I started to look at the world. Because when you start to see these patterns and you start to see these constructs, it becomes more and more apparent, and then you start searching for where they come from. Now, I will say, I have and will probably continue to be, or I have been and will continue to be probably, pretty obnoxious sometimes about these things that I challenge. And I can do it in a way that alienates people, and sometimes I do that unapologetically. Sometimes I really don't care who I alienate. I'm going to say what I want to say. But other times I worry that I do give the impression that I think I'm a lot better than the people I'm criticizing, when in fact the opposite is true. I think that I am very similar to those people, and I constantly recognize the amount of just work that it takes to be to make yourself into a better person. I don't mean better than someone else. I mean better than you have been in the past. And I feel like the skeptic community in a lot of ways is not willing to do that legwork, is not willing to be skeptical of itself, is not willing to be skeptical of members within the community to the level that it should be. A lot of the debates I watch among skeptic YouTubers really come off more like a circle jerk. It's very similar to watching a debate with nothing but certain kinds of feminists who agree. And I think that that can be really harmful, and it generally stunts the growth of the community. I think part of why the skeptic community has been losing a lot of footing in recent years is because they've latched onto this anti-feminism thing in such a disingenuous way. And you can try to argue that it's not disingenuous, but I have screenshots upon screenshots that beg to differ. It is in a disingenuous and deliberately strawmanning way, because it's more, I feel like they want something to fight against, and I feel like they're bored of fighting against right-wing conservative Christians, to be honest. But I think that through criticizing feminism, which honestly, if the criticisms were more nuanced, if it seemed like they actually read feminist theory to criticize it, if it seemed like they actually knew anything about what they were really talking about, I think I would have a very different perspective on the skeptic community, and I might even have a different perspective on feminism if it was being more sincerely criticized. Because to be honest, the most sincere criticisms I see of feminism come from within the feminist community. We're constantly debating, we're constantly arguing about what is and isn't okay, what is and isn't feminist, and there are just all of these completely different schools of thought, and I feel like it's honestly a much more dynamic community at this point than the skeptic community is. And I feel like there is eventually going to be this point where we start coming back together, where the more radical leftists, like I have been, stop being quite so radical and get more, not, I won't say more towards the middle, but more towards a consistent and more easily palatable ideology for most people. I think this radicalism is a lot of backlash towards the strong conservatism we've seen, and as a response, I think this upswing in leftists has made this like backlash response from the skeptics, who basically don't want anyone to have extreme opinions, which to an extent I understand, but I think there is a point where skeptics are often moderate to a fault, where they almost want to be superior about how moderate and objective they are, often about issues that don't actually impact them. So of course you can be moderate and objective when it's not your body, when it's not your family, when it's not your rights. And so for me, I found less and less and less that I was identifying with the skeptic community. I found less and less and less that I was identifying with these YouTubers. And I started to come to these conclusions even before I knew that the YouTubers that I grew up loving were infamous among more left-wing circles now. You know, I didn't come to these conclusions by reading a bunch of feminist think pieces on how evil The Amazing Atheist is. I watched more episodes. I keep saying episodes. I don't know what it is. I watched more videos by The Amazing Atheist, by Sargon of Akkad, by Croton T. Holy shit. By Thunderfoot, by Dark Matter 2525. I watched more videos by Bearing, and all of these YouTubers. I suddenly started to get this really unpleasant picture of people who just wanted to be superior to people and didn't really want to do anything productive with that superiority. And ultimately, I found it just very disappointing. I think that the values and ideas that the skeptic community espouses are useful and necessary. I think that a lot of skeptics are still really good people, and I think that their hearts are in the right place. They're just not willing to be as critical of themselves as I think they should be. I think if you look back on your views from 5 years ago and they're not any different, you're probably doing something wrong with what you're exposing yourself to. Humans are supposed to be dynamic and changing, and if you're not changing, it probably means that you're stagnating. And I think that's probably my biggest issue with the skeptic community, is I just see so much stagnation and such a lack of willingness to engage in the conversation that we're having now, the conversation that's evolving now, in a sincere way, that it's ultimately going to continue driving people away. And some of them will go to the alt-right, and some of them will go to the feminists, but I think the skeptic community is eventually going to get smaller and smaller. And the part of this that actually worries me is, while people who don't identify as any religion are increasing, I worry that less people proportionally will identify as atheists or really be willing to talk to atheists if they're considering reevaluating their faith. Because if we come off as smarmy and set in our ways and monolithic and tribalist and just tribalist, what am I looking for? I feel like that's the right word, whatever. If we come off as, you know, being uninterested in listening to this perspective, and we come off as entirely discarding these people as stupid, what we're doing is we're ultimately driving people away who might eventually agree with us. So I hope that one day I feel comfortable identifying as a skeptic and actively participating in the skeptic community again. But as it is, I'm honestly a lot more happy with the feminist community, and I find that they have much more productive discussions. So that's everything I have for you on this. I know this was kind of a long, rambly video and wasn't as ranty as normal, but I thought that, you know, it might explain a little bit of my perspective and how I arrived at that. And I really hope that this video is useful to you for whatever reason. Obviously, I'm sure I will see you anti-feminists down in the comments below. But anyone else who identifies as a part of the skeptic community, or who did, I'd love to hear your perspective on this matter down below. So that's everything I have for you on this. Vida Sane, bitches.